The prairie wind carried the scent of smoke and dust across the vast horizon, whispering secrets of an untamed land. It was a time when the earth belonged to the wild, when the mountains stood like guardians of ancient mysteries, and the rivers carved their eternal path through valleys that had witnessed countless generations. The sun dipped low, painting the sky with streaks of amber and crimson, as if nature herself was setting the stage for something fateful. On this evening, destiny stirred quietly, waiting for the moment it would step into the lives of three young women who found themselves at the edge of despair. They had been taken against their will, carried deep into a harsh world where cruelty reigned stronger than mercy. Their hearts pounded with fear as they were bound to a fate they could not yet see. Each of them carried different dreams, different memories of the lives they once knew, dreams of home, family, of laughter echoing in places far away. Yet here, among the rugged cliffs and shadows of the frontier, hope seemed like a fragile flame, flickering against the storm that threatened to extinguish it. The sound of horses, the jeers of strangers, and the unforgiving silence of night were their constant companions. But the land has a way of answering the cries of those who suffer, and that night, it answered in the form of a warrior. He came not with thunder or roar, but with the stillness of a predator and the strength of a spirit bound to the earth. His eyes were sharp as an eagle's, his movements as silent as the wind sliding through pine. An Apache warrior, molded by the harshness of the desert and the wisdom of his people, stepped into their path when all hope seemed lost. His presence was like a storm barely contained, a force that did not need to shout to be known. With him came both fear and safety, mystery and promise. To the women, he was at once a stranger and a savior, a man whose very stance declared that their lives were no longer entirely in the hands of fate. The rescue was swift, like lightning cutting through the dark. One moment, danger pressed upon them, and the next, it was scattered by the strength of his arm and the power of his resolve. He fought not only with skill, but with a fire that burned from something deeper than survival. By the time silence returned, the women stood free, though their hearts still beat with the shock of what had unfolded. The warrior looked upon them, his expression unreadable, his gaze lingering just long enough to assure them that he had not appeared by accident. And in that instant, though none of them spoke, something passed between them, an unspoken bond, delicate yet undeniable, as if the earth itself had woven their fates together. The journey that followed was not simple. Freedom carried its own weight, and every step away from captivity brought the women closer to questions they could not answer. Who was this man who risked his life for strangers? What did he see in them that made him act when others might have turned away? And more than that, what destiny awaited them now that their paths had entwined with his? They followed him through valleys where the moonlight painted the rocks silver, across plains where coyotes sang into the night, and through forests where every rustle of leaves carried the echo of spirits long gone. Fear gave way slowly to trust. Trust gave way to something gentler, still something they scarcely dared to name. For the women, the warrior was more than a guide. He was the living embodiment of strength and tenderness bound together. His silence was not emptiness, but a language of its own, one that spoke of battles fought, losses endured, and loyalty that could not be broken. When he tended the fire, when he offered them food, when his steady eyes met theirs across the glow of flames, they felt a warmth that reached deeper than the body. The land might still be wild, the nights long, and the dangers many, but beside him, the impossible seemed within reach. As days turned to nights and nights into days, their hearts began to carry questions unspoken, desires hidden in glances that lingered a moment too long. Was this bond only born of gratitude, or was it something richer, something destined by forces greater than themselves? Each woman felt the stir of emotions she had never known before, emotions that both frightened and thrilled her. The warrior, too, though he kept his silence, carried a weight in his eyes that hinted at an inner struggle, a battle between duty and something more tender, something he could not push away. Yet destiny is rarely gentle, and it never moves without purpose. Just when the women began to believe that safety was within reach, shadows rose again from the land. The past they had tried to escape was not willing to release them so easily. One evening, as the fire crackled low and the air grew thick with the quiet of approaching night, the warrior paused, listening to the wind as if it carried a warning only he could hear. His jaw tightened. His hand fell to the weapon at his side, and his gaze drifted toward the darkness beyond the circle of light. The women followed his eyes, their hearts quickening. Sensing the shift, even before they could see what stirred in the distance, they did not know if it was friend or foe, hope or doom that waited beyond the shadows. All they knew was that the moment held its breath, that their journey had only just begun, and that the bond between them was about to be tested in ways none of them could yet imagine. In the silence of that night, as stars watched from above and the earth itself seemed to tremble, they stood at the threshold of a destiny both beautiful and dangerous, one that would demand more of their hearts than they had ever given before. And in that fragile moment, as the firelight flickered across their faces, the question lingered like a secret in the dark. Was their unexpected destiny a blessing or a curse waiting to be revealed? The night grew heavier, and the crackle of the fire seemed smaller against the weight of silence pressing in from all sides. The warrior's eyes did not waver, fixed upon the darkness as though it spoke a language only he could understand. The three women sat close together, their breaths shallow, their bodies tense. Watching him with a mixture of fear and trust, they had been rescued, yes, but safety was a fragile word in this land. It was a gift that could vanish as quickly as it had appeared. They could feel that something, or someone, lingered just beyond the reach of the firelight, waiting for its chance. The warrior rose slowly, his tall frame casting a shadow that stretched long across the ground. He moved with a calmness that hid the storm in his chest. Every muscle seemed tuned to the rhythm of the night, every sound sharpened to warn him of danger. His hand brushed against the hilt of his blade, but he did not draw it. Instead, he stepped into the darkness, leaving the warmth of the fire behind. The women did not speak, though their hearts begged him to stay near. They knew instinctively that his presence was the thin line between life and death. Minutes felt like hours. The women whispered softly to one another, their voices trembling as they spoke of home, of the lives they had been torn from. Each had her own story, her own pain, yet now their fates were bound together in a way none of them had ever imagined. They wondered what force had led this Apache warrior to them, what power had stirred in him the will to fight for strangers. Was it chance, or was it something deeper, something written in the fabric of destiny long before they were born? The warrior returned at last, his face solemn, his eyes carrying a message he did not share aloud. He sat down at the fire again, his silence more unsettling than words could ever be. The women leaned closer, one of them daring to ask, in a voice barely above a whisper, if they were being followed. He did not answer, but the flicker of the flames caught the faintest tightening of his jaw. That was enough to confirm their fears. Danger was near, though they did not yet know its shape. As the fire dwindled, the women found their thoughts turning not only to fear, but also to him. In the light of the flames, he seemed carved from the earth itself, strong, unyielding, yet carrying a quiet sorrow in the depth of his eyes. He spoke little, but every glance, every movement revealed fragments of a story they longed to understand. Who was he beyond the warrior who had saved them? What losses had carved such silence into his soul? The land was vast and cruel, yet he moved through it as if it belonged to him, as if its wildness had made him what he was. The next morning, they traveled together across a land that was both beautiful and unforgiving. The sun rose over rolling plains, lighting fields of tall grass that swayed like an endless ocean. The women struggled to keep pace, yet the warrior slowed for them, his eyes scanning the horizon with constant vigilance. Though he offered them little conversation, he guided them with gestures, with glances, the kind of care that said more than words could. At times, one of them would catch his gaze lingering a moment too long, and in that fleeting second, warmth stirred where only fear had lived before. The land itself seemed alive with memory. They passed ancient stones etched by time, valleys where the wind carried the faint cry of eagles, and streams that sparkled beneath the morning sun. To the women, It felt as if they had stepped into another world, one ruled not by the laws of men, but by forces far older. The warrior moved as if in harmony with it all, his footsteps light, his awareness unbroken. The women began to sense that his bond with the land was not something learned, but something born into him. One evening, as they rested by a riverbank, the warrior finally broke his silence. His voice was deep, steady, like the echo of the mountains. He spoke of the Apache people, of their bond with the earth, of the strength drawn from rivers, stones, and skies. He told them that to walk upon this land was to carry both respect and responsibility. For the spirits of those who had lived before were never far away. The women listened with wide eyes, realizing that the man who had rescued them was not only a warrior, but a guardian of something far greater, though his words were few. They revealed a glimpse of the depth within him. The women felt their hearts stir with something they could not quite name: gratitude, admiration, perhaps even the first threads of love. Each of them carried it differently. One found comfort in his strength, another found hope in his quiet presence, and the third discovered a courage she had never known before. Yet none spoke of what weighed on their hearts, for fear of breaking the fragile balance that held them together. As days stretched into nights, the bond between them deepened, though it remained unspoken. They shared food, stories whispered under the stars, and moments of silence where only the sound of the wind filled the air. Yet beneath the surface, tension remained. The warrior's watchful eyes often drifted to the horizon, as though he expected shadows to rise at any moment. The women could sense it, too, that something unseen lingered behind them, closing in step by step. One night, as the fire burned low, the warrior's gaze locked on the darkness beyond. He rose suddenly, his hand gripping his weapon, and the women froze in place, their breath caught, their eyes wide, as the silence of the night was broken by the faint sound of movement in the distance. The warrior stepped forward, his figure outlined by the firelight, his every muscle tense. The women huddled together, their fear rising like a tide, waiting for the unseen to reveal itself, but the darkness gave no answers. The night stretched on, heavy with suspense, and the fire crackled as if mocking their unease. The warrior returned at last, his eyes still clouded with caution, and sat once more without a word. The women knew better than to press him, though their hearts burned with questions. All they understood was that their journey was not yet safe, and that the danger shadowing them would not release its grip so easily. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by dreams of pursuit, of hands reaching from the shadows, of voices whispering from the wind. The women clung to one another, their trust in the warrior the only anchor holding them steady. Each night brought the same fear, each morning the same unspoken question of whether they would live to see another dawn. And through it all, a bond grew stronger, not only between the women, but between them and the warrior. Silence spoke of burdens too heavy to share. The land carried them onward, deeper into its wild embrace, and with every mile their destinies intertwined more tightly. They could feel it in the way his eyes lingered upon them, in the way their hearts quickened when his hand brushed against theirs, in the way silence between them no longer felt empty, but charged with something powerful, something forbidden. Yet just as they began to accept the strange path unfolding before them, the horizon darkened once again, warning that their trials were far from over. The fire of their rescue had not yet burned out, and the shadows that hunted them had not yet shown their true face. The warrior's silence carried secrets. The land whispered warnings, and the women's hearts wrestled with desires they dared not speak aloud. Together, they stood on the edge of a destiny neither fully understood, a destiny that would demand more than courage, more than love, and more than trust. And as the wind howled through the canyons and the stars shimmered cold above, they knew the darkness was drawing nearer. Ready to test the fragile bond that held them together, the days that followed became a strange rhythm of movement and silence. Each sunrise bringing them deeper into the vast wilderness and closer to an unknown fate. The warrior guided the three women through winding canyons and across dry plains where the air shimmered with heat. At night, When the fire glowed faintly in the darkness, he kept watch while they tried to rest. It seemed as if he never truly slept, as though his spirit was bound to protect them even when his body cried out for rest. His silence was unbroken, except for short commands or warnings, yet his presence spoke louder than any words could. The women, though grateful, could not help but wonder why he had chosen to save them. It was not common in a world so brutal for a man to risk his life for strangers. Around the fire, they whispered their questions to one another, their voices low so he would not hear. Each carried her own thoughts. One believed it was honor, another thought it was compassion, and the third wondered if destiny itself had drawn him to them. None of them dared to ask him directly, for there was something about him that made them hold their words back. His silence demanded respect, and in that silence, they began to notice things that unsettled them. His gaze often drifted to the horizon, his shoulders tense as if he carried memories he did not wish to share. On the fourth evening, as the sky burned red with the dying sun, the warrior finally broke his silence. He told them they could not remain together for long. Danger was closing in, he said, and the men who had once taken them would not stop until they had what they wanted. His words made the women shiver, for they had hoped their escape had put an end to their suffering. Instead, it seemed it had only begun. He spoke of enemies who hunted like wolves, tireless and ruthless. The women listened, their hearts sinking as the firelight cast long shadows across their faces. That night, sleep refused to come. One of the women lay awake, her eyes fixed on the warrior's silhouette as he stood at the edge of camp, watching the darkness. She felt both fear and comfort in his presence. The memory of his strength when he had rescued them was still vivid.
Ow.
And yet there was something else growing within her, something she could not name. It was not only gratitude, but something deeper, a pull she did not want to admit even to herself. She turned away, her cheeks burning, and whispered a prayer to the stars that the coming days would bring them safety. But safety remained far away. The following day, as they crossed a dry ravine, the warrior stopped suddenly, crouching low to the ground. The women froze, their breaths caught in their throats. He studied the earth with careful eyes, his hand brushing over faint tracks left in the dust. His jaw tightened as he rose to his feet, his gaze turning to the horizon where the land stretched endless and empty. He said nothing, but they understood well enough. They were being followed. The knowledge settled into their bones like ice, and though they did not see the pursuers, they felt their presence pressing in from behind. As they pushed onward, the tension grew heavier. Every sound of the wind seemed sharper. Every shadow on the rocks seemed to move. The women whispered less, their eyes darting nervously to the edges of the path. The warrior urged them to move faster, his voice steady but urgent. They obeyed, though their bodies ached from the journey, their feet raw and weary. Still, they pressed on, for they knew their lives depended on his judgment. By evening, they reached a grove of cottonwood trees, where the warrior allowed them to rest. He built a small fire, its flames barely reaching above the stones he had carefully placed around it, so its light would not travel far. The women gathered close, the warmth of the flames barely enough to chase away the chill in their hearts. One of them asked him quietly what he planned to do if their pursuers caught up. His eyes flickered to hers, and though he did not answer directly, the hardness in his gaze told her everything. He was ready to fight, even if it cost him his life. The weight of his silence pressed upon them, and yet it also bound them closer. They began to sense that he carried more than just the burden of their safety. Something in his past lingered, something that haunted him. Though he never spoke of it, they could feel it in the way he stared into the fire at night, in the way his jaw clenched when he heard distant sounds, in the way he carried himself like a man who had lost more than he had gained. One of the women, her curiosity stronger than her fear, dared to ask him if he had family waiting for him somewhere. His eyes darkened, and he shook his head without a word. She regretted asking, yet the answer or lack of one revealed more than she had expected. Days passed, and the land grew harsher. Food became scarce, and water harder to find. The women began to falter, their strength waning, but the warrior carried them through it. He hunted quietly, his skill with bow and blade unmatched, and brought back what little he could. He led them to hidden springs, places known only to those who walk the land with the eyes of one who belonged to it. Without him, they knew they would not survive. And yet, even in their exhaustion, something else grew between them. A strange warmth, born in the midst of hardship, began to shape their journey. Glances lingered longer. Touches seemed heavier with meaning, and silence carried unspoken words. But beneath this fragile bond, danger stalked closer. One afternoon, as they climbed the side of a rocky ridge, the sound of distant horses carried on the wind. The warrior froze, his eyes narrowing as he listened. The women felt their stomachs twist with fear. Whoever pursued them was no longer far behind. He urged them onward, faster this time, his voice sharp with urgency. They stumbled over stones and scraped their hands on jagged rocks, but they did not slow. Behind them, the sound grew clearer, the steady rhythm of hooves. Closing in with every heartbeat, as night fell, they reached a cave hidden in the cliffs, where the warrior led them inside. He told them to remain silent, his eyes never leaving the mouth of the cave. The women huddled together, their fear so strong it left them trembling. They could hear the horses now, closer than ever, their riders calling to one another in harsh voices. The sound echoed across the cliffs, filling the cave with dread. The warrior stood ready, his hand on his weapon, his body poised like a shadow against the stone. The women clung to one another, their hearts racing as the voices grew louder. They knew the men who hunted them were not far, and the thin wall of stone was all that kept them hidden. The fire they had grown used to was gone, replaced by cold darkness. Every breath felt too loud, every shift of movement too dangerous. They waited, their bodies rigid, their minds consumed by fear. In the silence of that cave, the women realized that their lives had changed forever. No matter what awaited them beyond those cliffs, they could never return to who they had been before. The land, the warrior, the fear, and the fragile bond that had begun to form between them, all of it, had carved new paths within their hearts. Paths that led into uncertainty, into danger, and perhaps into something deeper than any of them had dared to dream. The sound of the horses faded at last, swallowed by the night, but the danger was not gone. The warrior remained at the entrance, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his body still as stone. The women lay in the darkness, unable to sleep, listening to the steady rhythm of their own hearts. They knew this was only the beginning, that the shadows would return, and that the destiny they had been pulled into was far from clear. And in that silence, as fear gripped them tighter than ever, they could not help but wonder whether their unexpected fate was leading them toward salvation or ruin. The cave held them through the night, its walls damp and cold, its shadows alive with their fear. None of the women spoke, their voices locked tight in their throats. The warrior stood like stone at the mouth of the cave, his figure outlined faintly by the pale light of the moon. His silence was heavy, but beneath it lay a storm, one the women could feel in the air around him. His hand never strayed far from his weapon, his eyes never wavered from the horizon. When the first light of dawn broke across the cliffs, he turned to them with a sharp gesture, urging them to move. They followed, their legs weak from lack of sleep, their minds clouded with worry. Each step down the ridge felt like a step closer to fate. The land stretched vast and endless, yet it felt small, as though walls of unseen danger closed in around them. Every rustle in the brush made their hearts leap. Every distant sound carried the threat of discovery. The warrior's pace quickened, his body tense, as if he sensed the shadows closing the distance behind them. As the sun rose higher, they crossed a barren stretch of land where the wind howled and the earth cracked beneath their feet. There was no cover here, nowhere to hide, and the women felt exposed beneath the unyielding sky. The warrior paused often, his sharp gaze sweeping the horizon, his jaw set like iron. He did not speak, but they understood. Their pursuers were near. The women exchanged glances, their fear mirrored in one another's eyes. They clung to the hope that his strength could carry them through, but doubt crept in like a chill, whispering that even he could not fight forever. By midday, the faint echo of hooves reached their ears once more. This time, there was no mistaking it. The sound rolled over the plain like thunder, steady, and merciless. The women froze, their breaths shallow, but the warrior motioned them onward, his eyes burning with urgency. He led them toward a cluster of jagged rocks rising from the earth like the bones of some ancient beast. Here, he guided them into a narrow passage, the stones pressing close on either side. The women stumbled after him, their hands scraping against the rough walls, their hearts pounding. Inside the passage, the sound of hooves grew louder, closer, echoing like a drumbeat of doom. The warrior stopped at a bend, his hand raised for silence. He turned to them, his eyes fierce and unwavering, and in a voice low but steady, he told them they must not make a sound, no matter what they heard. His words struck deep, and the women nodded, their fear tying their tongues. He moved forward alone, his figure swallowed by the shadows of the rocks, leaving them pressed together in the narrow space, their bodies trembling. The minutes dragged like hours. The women could hear the shouts of riders now, harsh voices carried on the wind, their words sharp, though distant. They clutched each other, every sound cutting through them like a blade. Then came the silence, heavy and complete, before breaking once more with the crack of whips and the neigh of horses. The enemy was close, far too close, from where they crouched. The women caught faint glimpses of the warrior as he moved with deadly grace along the ridge above. He was a shadow, silent and unseen, yet his presence filled the air with raw tension. He studied the riders below, his body taut like a bowstring. The women watched, their fear mingled with awe. For in him they saw not only a protector, but a force born of the wild land itself. Yet they also knew the danger he faced was immense. There were too many, their numbers overwhelming. Even his strength might not be enough. The riders passed beneath them, their voices rough, their weapons glinting in the sun. The women dared not breathe as the men searched the land, calling to one another, their eyes scanning the rocks. For a moment, it seemed as if they might ride on. But then one of them halted, pointing toward the narrow passage where the women hid. Their blood ran cold. Before the riders could move closer, a sharp cry rang out from above. The warrior leaped from the ridge, his figure cutting through the air like a hawk. He struck the ground with a force that sent dust and stone flying, his weapon already flashing in the sun. The clash was sudden, brutal, the sound of steel against steel echoing across the plain. The women covered their mouths to keep from crying out, their eyes wide with terror as the battle unfolded. The warrior fought with a fury that left them breathless. He moved like the wind, his strikes swift and merciless, his every motion guided by instinct honed through countless battles. Yet for every enemy he struck down, another pressed forward, their shouts filling the air. The women clung to one another, torn between fear for their own lives and fear for his. They could not bear the thought of losing him, not after all he had done, not after all that had grown unspoken between them. The battle raged, dust rising in a storm around the fighters. The warrior's strength seemed endless, yet the tide pressed hard against him. Blood stained the ground, the cries of men and horses mingling with the clash of steel. The women felt their hearts breaking with each moment, the weight of helplessness crushing them. They longed to run to him, to aid him in some way, yet they knew they would only hinder his fight. All they could do was watch, their bodies trembling, their souls bound to his fate. Then, as the dust began to clear, the sound of a horn pierced the air. More riders approached from the distance, their figures dark against the burning horizon. The women gasped, their hopes sinking as they realized the battle was far from over. The warrior stood tall, his chest heaving, his blade dripping red, but his eyes did not waver. He turned toward the approaching threat, his body ready, though his strength was waning. The women knew the moment was building toward something greater, something terrible. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, the wind stilling, the sun glaring down with merciless fire. Every heartbeat stretched into eternity, the suspense unbearable. The warrior stood alone against the rising tide, his figure etched in their minds as both savior and sacrifice. The women felt their spirits break and strengthen at once. Torn between despair and fierce loyalty, the riders drew nearer, their cries echoing across the plain, their weapons raised high. The warrior stepped forward, his body a wall between them and the women he had sworn to protect. The women clung to the shadows, their hearts pounding, their voices silent prayers to any force that might hear them. They knew the climax of their struggle was near, that the path ahead would decide not only their lives, but the fate of the bond that had formed between them. And as the ground shook beneath the charge of hooves, as the warrior raised his blade once more, and as the women felt the weight of destiny press down upon them, the air was thick with tension so sharp it seemed the world itself might break. The moment of reckoning loomed, the resolution hidden just beyond reach, and the suspense hung like a blade above them all. The sound of hooves thundered across the plain, and the warrior braced himself as the riders came on fast, dust rising behind them like a storm. The three women clung to one another in the shadows of the rocks, their hearts beating with the rhythm of the ground itself. Every breath they drew felt stolen, every moment stretched into eternity as the clash drew closer. The warrior's blade flashed in the light, his eyes locked on the oncoming wave. And in that instant he was no longer a man, but the living spirit of the land. He stood tall, unyielding, though his body bore the marks of battle already fought. The riders charged, their shouts echoing, their weapons raised high. The warrior surged forward, meeting them with a force that shook the earth. Steel rang out, cries filled the air, and the clash was so fierce the women could hardly bear to watch. Yet through the fear, through the chaos, they saw the truth of who he was. He was not fighting only for their lives, but for something greater in honor that went beyond himself. It got a duty carved deep into his soul. He struck with the strength of all he had lost, and all he refused to lose again. The battle raged on, but the tide began to shift. The warrior moved with tireless resolve, his strikes cutting through the chaos. His body fueled by a fire no enemy could extinguish. One by one, the riders fell or fled, their cries swallowed by the wind. The dust settled, the sound of hooves faded, and at last the plain fell silent. The women dared to look up, their eyes wide with disbelief. He stood alone, his blade lowered, his chest heaving, his figure strong though worn by the struggle. Around him lay the mark of victory, and with it the shadow of what it had cost. For a moment none of them spoke. The women stepped slowly from their hiding place, their feet unsteady, their hearts trembling with relief. They moved toward him, their eyes filled with both gratitude and awe. He turned to them, his gaze steady, but in the depth of his eyes was a sorrow that could not be hidden. Though he had saved them, though he had fought with all his strength, the weight of his silence returned heavier than before. It was not only the battle he carried, but the burden of his own past. The memories of loss that lingered like scars unseen. One of the women reached out, her hand trembling as it touched his arm. She whispered thanks, her voice breaking with emotion. The other two joined her, their words spilling from hearts too full to contain. They spoke of how he had given them life, when all hope seemed gone. How his courage had carried them through fear too great to bear. He listened, though he did not answer, for words could not hold the depth of what they shared in that moment. It was more than gratitude. It was a bond forged in fire, in blood, in the silence of the wilderness. In the days that followed, they traveled together once more, but the land seemed different now. The air was lighter, the horizon less threatening. Though danger was never far, the women carried a new strength within them. The warrior guided them still, his presence a shield, but their steps no longer faltered with fear. They had seen the worst of the storm and survived, and with that survival came a courage that could not be taken from them. As they walked, they spoke more freely, sharing stories of their lives before captivity. They told of family and home, of laughter lost and dreams still waiting. The warrior listened, his silence softening, and at times a faint smile touched his lips. Though his words remained few, the women felt his presence weaving into their stories, as if he too belonged within them. Slowly, the distance between them began to fade, replaced by something tender, something unspoken yet deeply felt. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, painting the sky in gold and crimson, the warrior finally spoke of his own past. His voice was steady, but heavy with memory. He told them of his people, of a home once full of life and song, now touched by loss and struggle. He spoke of battles fought not only with weapons but with the will to survive, of loved ones taken by the cruelty of the world. The women listened in silence, their hearts aching with his pain. They saw in him not only the strength of a warrior, but the soul of a man who had endured more than most could bear in his story. They found a reflection of their own. Loss, fear, and survival bound them together, weaving their fates into one. Though their lives had been torn apart, they had found one another, and in that bond lay the promise of healing. The women did not speak promises of the future, for the land was still harsh, and the world still uncertain. Yet in the way they looked at him, in the way their hands lingered near his, there was an understanding deeper than words. At last, they reached the edge of familiar land. The women recognized the hills that marked the path back to their people, their eyes shining with relief and hope. Yet their hearts grew heavy, for they knew the moment of parting had come. They turned to him, their voices soft with gratitude and sorrow. They begged him to come with them, to leave the wilderness behind, and find peace among those who would welcome him. He looked at them long, his gaze steady. And for a moment the weight of choice pressed heavy upon him, but the warrior belonged to the land. He had fought for them, guided them, and given them the chance to live, yet his path was not theirs. He shook his head, his silence saying more than words ever could. He touched each of their hands in turn, his eyes meeting theirs, leaving in them the fire of his strength. He told them, with the few words he offered, that their lives were their own now, and that they must walk forward with courage. The women wept, though they understood. They promised they would never forget him, that his name would live in their stories and in their hearts. He turned from them, his figure strong against the setting sun, and walked back into the wilderness, his shadow merging with the land he called home. The women watched until he was gone, their tears falling not only from sorrow, but from gratitude and love, too deep to name. When they returned to their people, they carried with them more than survival. They carried the memory of a man who had shown them what it meant to fight, to endure, to protect, even in the face of impossible odds. Their stories spread, whispered by firesides and told to children, of the Apache warrior who had rescued them and given them back their lives. And though his name faded into legend, the truth of who he was lived on in the strength of their hearts. Each woman walked her path differently. One returned to family, finding comfort in the arms of those who had feared her lost. Another sought to build anew, her courage guiding her to a future she had once thought impossible. The third carried his memory most deeply, her heart forever touched by the bond they had shared. Yet all of them knew that their lives had been changed forever, shaped by the journey that had tested them and the man who had saved them. And somewhere in the wilderness, beneath the wide sky and the endless horizon, the warrior walked on. His path remained his own, bound to the land, to the spirits of his people, and to the silence that had always been his companion. Yet within him lived the memory of 3 women whose lives had crossed his own, whose courage had matched his, and whose bond had given him something he thought long lost, a reason to hope again.